first question then, Will. So pick up the timeline. As I understand it, on December 5th, 1989, Robbie Powell was taken by ambulance to Morriston Hospital. How ill was Robbie at that point?
Well, he was actually seriously ill. He was critically dehydrated. He was vomiting. He had abdominal pain. He'd lost a third of his body weight. And we were told he'd arrived just on time.
Okay. And what were you told was wrong with him at that point by the hospital
Well, they
staff?
put him on,
Sorry.
sorry, they put him on an intravenous strip. They took bloods to check his blood. And I now know that when the bloods come back by around 12 o'clock midnight, it was in the evening that Robbie was admitted around 10 o'clock.
Okay.
And they had the bloods by 12. And apparently they're absolutely characteristic of Addison's disease.
Right.
So all we were concerned about is that Robert was receiving treatment and that hopefully he was going to be okay. But nobody discussed anything with us.
Okay. And how long was Robbie in hospital for?
He was in for 4 days.
Okay then. And who were some of the doctors who were treating Robbie at that point? Did you realize that Dr. Dewi Evans was one of the doctors?
All I didn't know. In fact, I didn't really know the doctors because my wife was staying there most of the time, and I was coming home to see to our two children that we had, our other two boys. So I know that Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Forbes were doctors that seen and examined Robbie over the 4 days.
Right, okay. Publicly, Dr. Evans has said that he had no involvement in the case, but I think you have his name on a fluid balance chart or balancing electrolytes. So does that make sense to you that he said that publicly?
Well, what he's doing is denying any knowledge of Robbie's case until the time that he died.
Right.
But when you consider that Robert was in hospital late in the evening, there wouldn't have been a paediatrician on duty. And I assume that he was contacted, told the electrolytes, and that he gave the fluids and advised which fluids Robert should have. But obviously, I can't prove that. But why would the nurse write Dewi Evans on the fluid charts? It was the first one of that night.
Yeah. And then, so what would happen at the January 1990 consultation with Dr. Forbes?
Well, my wife took him because I was actually working. And when Robbie was taken to Dr. Forbes, he couldn't believe it was the same child that had been so ill 4 months earlier. And he told Diane, I don't need to do anything to him. And my wife asked, was it gastroenteritis caused by a throat infection? And Dr. Forbes told her yes. There was no mention whatsoever of the suspicion of Addison's. No mention that Robert needed an ACTH test. And Dr. Forbes at that stage could have taken Robbie's bloods to check for cortisol and for ACTH. And in someone suffering from Addison's disease or adrenal failure, you'd have low cortisol and elevated ACTH in your blood. And he never took any of these tests.
Okay, then. And then on April the 2nd, 1990, Robbie would start the first of, I think, 7 consultations in 15 days with 5 different GPs. Can you describe that?
Yes, I can. When Robbie was in hospital, it was the first time that any of our 3 children had been seriously ill. So the last thing we wanted when Robert became unwell again was for the same position that we were in, and that was our understanding that he almost died. So I told my wife, I'll take Robbie down to the health centre, which I did on the 2nd of April, and he was seen by Dr. Elwyn Hughes, who was actually the GP who had referred Robbie to hospital by ambulance 4 months earlier. Because we were told it was gastroenteritis, or my wife was told, and she told me, I said to the doctor about him referring Robbie in the event that he may have forgotten. And he
Mm,
clearly did remember Robbie, but what he said is, I can find nothing wrong with him. And he didn't look in the medical records.
mm, okay. So Dr. Mike Williams, I think he was the only GP who said that he read the medical records. Um,
Yes.
but in the end, he didn't actually refer Robbie back to the hospital. Why do you think he didn't refer him back?
Well, after Robbie was taken on the 2nd, he was taken then again on the 6th. He was sent to school. He was sent home from school unwell. I took him on the 6th to see Dr. Flower.
Mhm,
She said she could find nothing wrong with him. We come home, and then Robert started deteriorating even further.
mhm.
And he started to vomit after eating, trying to eat some food. And I and my wife took Robbie to Dr. Williams on the 11th of April. This was the third GP. Now, he gave Robert a Urolite specifically for the vomiting. He claims he read the medical records, although I didn't know what they'd read within the notes because we knew nothing about the Addisons or the test. He said he's going to refer Robbie immediately back to Morrison Hospital and Dr. Forbes. That's what he told us, and we felt that he was going to do that immediately, as he said that.
Okay, then. And then, so for the benefit of the viewer, I think I should probably say at this point that unfortunately Robbie would pass away from Addison's disease, wouldn't he? So I won't ask you to relive the the final moments because I'm sure that's a very painful moment. But then I think 3 days after Robbie's passing, Dr. Keith Hughes he made an appointment to call at your house after the coroner had informed you that he died of Addison's disease.
I
Is
think
that that? Sorry, go on.
I think the history has to go on a little bit though,
Okay,
because Robbie was seen, as I said, on the 11th of April by Dr. Williams. So by
okay,
that time, we'd seen Dr. Elwyn Hughes, Dr.
right.
Flower, and now Dr. Williams.
Mhm,
Now we just went home. He gave the Oralite, or prescribed the Oralite for the vomiting. Didn't warn us that Robert could die of adrenal failure because Addison was suspected, and didn't discuss anything with us. Robert started to deteriorate to such an extent that he couldn't walk. He was weak in bed. And
mhm,
I decided then to take him to see a GP again. And I phoned the health centre, and Dr. Ball has told me to bring Robert down to the community hospital, this being the 15th of April. I had to carry Robbie from his bed to the car, carry him from the car into the consultation room, and he was examined by Dr. Bollards. What I didn't know is that Dr. Bollards had received one of the letters from Dr. Forbes at the hospital about adrenal insufficiency and Addison's disease.
right.
Now, according to Dr. Bollards, he didn't realize that at that time. But he examined Robbie and he couldn't really find anything wrong, except he thought it could be glandular fever. And he
Right.
prescribed medication. But what he said is, I'm going to request blood tests now for you to bring Robbie to the health centre on the 17th of April, which was actually the Easter Tuesday.
Okay.
We told Dr. Bolas about the referral by Dr. Williams, assuming it had been done, but obviously we didn't know. Well, Robert came home with us. I carried him back to the car. Dr. Bolas recalls this, that he was so weak. Now, the next day, which was the 16th of April, he started to vomit froth. So
Right.
we called the GP again, and Dr. Keith Hughes came out.
Okay.
Now, Robert was complaining of being hot and cold, and he was irritable. And this is a symptom of Addison's disease. Now,
Right.
we'd put a cover over him because he said he was cold, but he seemed to have a bit of a temperature. So when the GP walked in, he pulled the cover. Robert was lying on the couch. He
Mm,
pulled the cover off him and threw it over to my wife, who was sitting on one of the chairs. He
right.
said,
Okay.
"You don't cover a child with a temperature." And I said, well, we only did what he'd asked. But in any event, his attitude changed. He examined Robert and he said, look, I think I'll do a blood sugar test. So he goes to his car, gets a blood sugar test, checks it out, comes to the house, and then says, I'm sorry, I can't do the blood sugar test. It's out of date. So he didn't do it. I asked him whether Robert should be referred back to the hospital because he'd been ill now for 2 weeks. And he said there was no need. But if Robbie deteriorated, then he would admit him to hospital. Next day, Robert wanted to be helped to the toilet because he couldn't walk himself. And as my wife held him up, he slipped through my wife's hands and fainted on the floor. She screamed for me. This is the 17th of April, the day he died. Diane screamed for me. I ran into the bathroom. Robbie was unconscious. I ran downstairs to the telephone, phoned the health centre and said, I need a doctor immediately. My 10-year-old child, Robbie, has fainted. And who comes now is Dr. Flower approximately half an hour later, by which time Robert's regained consciousness, temporarily lost his vision. He's got dilated pupils and blue lips, which we didn't recognise the seriousness of it. She examines him and says, no, there's no need to go to hospital. I then said, but the senior partner the next day, the previous day, Dr. Keith Hughes, had said he'll go in if he deteriorates. He's clearly deteriorated because he fainted. She refuses to admit the child. And she goes from the house. She reckons that the throat infection or the glandular fever, which is in your foot, has gone now to his chest. So she goes and we're still worried. So I phone the hospital. In effect, they tell me, trust the GP. I actually phoned Ward 7 where Robbie had been previously. So we got the GP out again. And she again refused hospital admission. I had a heated argument with her, and she then decided she would refer Robbie. And she wrote out a referral letter while I went upstairs, wrapped Robbie in his blanket to carry him hopefully to the ambulance, or for the ambulance men to take him to the hospital. But when I come downstairs, I asked if she'd ordered an ambulance. She actually threw the referral letter towards me and said, take him by car. And she stormed out the house. I then carried Robbie into the car, drove him to Morrison Hospital, which was 12 miles away. Took me approximately half an hour. When I carried him into the ward, Robbie stopped breathing. His mouth was wide open. His eyes were fixed in the back of his head. And I shouted, Robbie, Robbie. There was no response. And I was told to leave the room. He was later declared dead.
Right. Okay. I guess it never gets easier telling that story.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it's a very hard story to tell. And then 3 days after Robbie passed away, I think that Keith Hughes, he will come to your house. And I think at that point, you've been told by the coroner for the first time about Addison's disease. And he had said that Robbie had died from Addison's disease. And then I think that was when you saw the notes for the first time. Is that right?
Well, yes, just to elaborate a little bit on that, then I had told the coroner's officer when I spoke to him up until the post-mortem that I believe Robbie had died of neglect. Okay, and I think any parent who would lose a child in the circumstances that we lost Robbie would think the same.
Right, okay, yeah.
Now, I know he communicated that to the coroner, but the coroner ordered an inquest, and who performed the inquest was a pathologist associated with Morrison Hospital, who would later admit negligence for Robbie's death. And she had ruled that Robbie had died exclusively of natural causes. So the coroner's decision on the inquest was communicated to me 3 days after Robbie's death, saying it's natural causes and there would be no inquest. Shortly after that, Keith Hughes telephoned and asked if he could come to the house to discuss Robbie's death. And I said yes.
Mhm.
With him, he brought the records, and my two sisters were in the room with me, but I had warned them not to interfere with the conversation because it was difficult for the doctor. He'd seen Robbie the day before he died. It was certainly difficult for me, but I didn't want my sisters interfering. And the question I asked Dr. Keith Hughes first was, did Robbie have to die? And he said no. Well, both my sisters became upset.
I
So
can
I asked
imagine.
them to leave the room. So when I asked Keith Hughes started to explain to me what Addison's disease was, I said I wasn't really interested at that stage and asked if I could see the medical records that he had. And I took
Right.
the thin records and I went through them. And I
Mhm.
read one document that said information needs ACTH test, parents informed. And I immediately became annoyed, saying, what the hell is this test?
Mhm.
I know nothing about it. And
Mhm.
Keith Hughes admitted then that the hospital had suspected Addison's. And when I read further through the notes, there was a letter saying specifically that Robert was suspected of having Addison's disease and that he should be referred back to hospital immediately if he became unwell.
Right.
Now, I'm in a position now that the GPs have been told three really important pieces of information. One, that Addison's is suspected, which invariably results in death without treatment. It's a serious condition to have. That the ACTH test had been ordered and that we'd been told about it when we hadn't. But most importantly, these GPs have been told to refer Robbie immediately back to hospital if he became unwell. And he's been seen now 5 times in the last 15 days of his life.
Yeah.
Three doctors 4 times in the last 3 days.
Mhm.
So clearly I was annoyed about that situation and the doctor left.
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess in maybe in modern terms, I don't know, maybe the easiest way to think about that is it's almost like, say, all the doctors had to do was maybe read a page of the medical notes instead of scrolling Facebook for the 15th time or, whatever they would do. I don't know what they would have been doing, but it was very negligent, really, wasn't it?
It was terrible. What they should have done, Stuart, is when they received the correspondence from the hospital in relation to the Addison's disease and the test, it should have been flagged up. They
Yeah.
should have had that in the beginning of the records, as you would if someone had an allergy towards penicillin or they had diabetes or wherever. It should be there for the doctor to see it immediately. And they
Yeah.
didn't do that.
Hmm.
So I knew straight away then that Robert should never have died because I'd read up then on Addison's and realised then it was treatable. And there was
Right.
other symptoms that Robbie had that hadn't been discussed. He had pigmentation of the skin.
Hmm.
But nobody asked us, nor did we mention it because we didn't know the relevance.
Right.
He was
Okay.
also he was also a contact with TB twice, once when he was 4, once when he was 6. And
Okay.
TB used to be the cause, or one of the causes for Addison's disease. So that was relevant
Okay.
as well. So I
Mhm.
knew Robert shouldn't have died. And I knew that these records incriminated these doctors and proved probably that they were grossly negligent.
Mhm. Okay.
Can I just
So I
interrupt
just,
just for a
Yeah.
second now? I'm sorry, Will, but it's just something that's occurred to me while you were speaking there, and what I've seen a lot in the documents that I've read is the assertion that the doctors couldn't be expected to have diagnosed Addison's disease, and that may be the case. There's it's clear that it's a very difficult disease to diagnose, and they may not have been in the best position to do so. But what is clear in the documents is that Robbie was very, very ill. He was a little boy who was very, very ill, and should have received appropriate treatment, whether they diagnosed a particular disease or not. And I think a lot's been made in the papers about, that we shouldn't blame the doctors too much because they weren't able to diagnose Addison's. what they had in front of them was a very ill little boy who we now know tragically passed away because of the treatment that he didn't receive. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important point. But what you also have to remember, really, is they've argued that Addison's is difficult to diagnose. It's not difficult to diagnose. It's difficult to suspect, Steve, because of the rarity of it. And what people have to realize is they doctors were told it was suspected. They didn't have to diagnose it. So the point that you're making, I think, is he was so seriously ill, even if he hadn't been suspected of Addison's, they should have acted and gotten straight to hospital.
Exactly right. Exactly that. Well, yeah.
And I agree with that. But when you add into it that he was suspected of Addison's, that the ACTH test had been ordered and not done, and that they were told to get him to hospital immediately if he became unwell, I think makes the position a lot more serious for their failures.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think on April 23rd, a couple of days later, you invited Keith Hughes back to your house. But
Yes.
this time you had Reverend Thomas there as well. So did you realize how important it would be to invite him to that meeting at the time?
Well, I did know that because what I did is when I the three pieces of information I had, I felt was very damning against the doctors and their failures in Robbie's care. So I phoned my best friend up, Sid Herbert, and I told him what I read in the notes, and he couldn't believe it. And I said, Sid, I want you to witness the medical records. I'm worried that they may take out this crucial information because it doesn't give them a defense. Mm-hmm. And my good friend said, Will, I'm your best friend. If they did take it out after I saw it, they'd raise that in any court of law that you'd lie for Will Powell. So he suggested I get someone independent. Mm-hmm. Now, the Reverend Thomas was elderly, and he lived 3 doors down from where I live. And I didn't really know him other than to say hello. But when Robbie died, he came to the house to pass on his condolences. And he said, if I can do anything to help you, please let me know. So after discussing it with Sid, I decided to ask the Reverend Thomas if he'd kindly come to my house on the 23rd of April at 1:45, that you would bring a notebook and pen, and I wanted him to witness what I had read in the notes. And that's what happened. He did come at 1:45. I requested that Keith Hughes comes and brings the medical records, which he did. He was quite shocked when the Reverend Thomas was there. And the first question I asked him was, did Robert have to die? And he said words to the effect, I'll have to be careful what I'm saying because the Reverend Thomas is taking notes. Okay. And I got the records from him. I passed them to the Reverend Thomas. He made a contemporaneous note, which I still have, the original, and it confirmed exactly what I had seen.
Okay. All right. So I think at some point down the line, you would become aware that Mrs. Linda Sims had written a backdated letter for Dr. Mike Williams. How did you become aware of this, and what were the contents of that letter?
Right. What happened was this. Dr. Williams on the 11th of April said he would refer Robbie immediately. When Robbie died, Dr. Williams came to my home. Dr. Williams was asked by me in the presence of my wife and subsequently in the presence of my father-in-law whether he'd referred Robbie back to hospital as he told us he was going to do. And he said he had done. I had no reason to disbelieve him. However, when I met Dr. Forbes on the 25th of May 1990, after he invited us to come down, I did a questionnaire. And I still have that original piece of paper. And the first question was, which I knew the answer to, was, did you suspect Addison's disease or any other hormonal problem. And before he could answer it, or before I could ask it, to be honest, he said, look, I suspected Addison's. I'm so sorry. I wish I'd done it. I told the GPs everything. And he pointed to the very letter that I'd seen in the GP notes.
Right.
So the question I then asked him was, what date did you receive the referral letter from Dr. Williams? And he said, I've not received a referral letter from Dr. Williams. All I received from Dr. Williams was a phone call the following day. So now I've got two pieces of information at conflict. Dr. Williams said he'd made the referral. Dr. Forbes, 5 weeks after Robbie's death, says he hadn't.
Right.
But what happened then was the doctors made a statement in response to my complaint. They made individual statements and a combined statement. That was the 5 doctors signed it. And on several occasions, it states that Robbie had been referred back to Dr. Forbes, which I knew was a lie, Stuart, because Dr. Forbes had said he hadn't had a letter. So I contacted Dr. Forbes and I asked him I asked Dr. Forbes, what date did you receive the referral letter from Dr. Williams? He responded in writing, and what he said was worse to the effect, I can confirm that neither I nor the outpatients department received a referral letter dated 11th of April. Well, that was the day that Dr. Williams saw Robbie, which I hadn't discussed with him. Plus, it also meant that there could be a letter dated the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, or the 17th. So I phoned him up again. I said, Dr. Forbes, you said you haven't got a letter dated 11th of April. I said, but have you received a referral letter? And if so, what date? So he then sends me another letter, which says I can confirm that neither I nor the outpatients department received a referral letter prior to Robbie's death. Now that indicated that there could have been one post-death. So I phoned him up again. I said, Dr. Forbes, you told me and my wife on the 25th of May when we met that you had not received a referral letter from these GPs. I'm asking you now to confirm because it must have been 5 weeks after Robbie's death at least before you received it. I want you to confirm the date. Well, he never answered that. He never confirmed.
Right. Okay.
So when I got the medical records a couple of months later, it was actually November of 1990, inside the GP notes was a referral letter dated the 12th of April. There was also an envelope addressed to the appointments officer, Morrison Hospital, which had been torn open. And there was also a referral letter that had been signed. And I immediately thought that Dr. Forbes had agreed to take that referral letter and put it in the hospital notes and to say that he didn't receive it until after Robbie's death, meaning he could have done nothing about it. But because I made such a fuss with Dr. Forbes and told him that he told me he hadn't received a referral letter, I believe he gave it back to the GPs. The GPs come up with a second story then that they believed because they had to justify now why they said he'd been referred on several occasions when he hasn't been. So they come up with another plan, and that was to say that the referral went through the process on the 12th of April. The copy would be put in the notes, and that the signed copy would be put in an envelope to the appointments officer of Morrison Hospital and sealed. But that got misplaced and it was never sent. And they found it subsequently, thus the way it was torn open. But I knew that on the 20th of April, there was not a copy of that referral letter in Robbie's GP notes. So I went down the health centre and I challenged Keith Hughes. And I said, Dr. Hughes, when you came to my house, that referral letter copy was not in Robbie's notes. I'm now asking you, was it? He said, no. I said, confirm that in writing. So he actually confirmed in writing, and I have the letter, that that copy was not in the GP notes either on the 20th or the 23rd when it was seen by the Reverend Thomas. I then asked for a statement from the person who typed that referral letter. He initially told me it was a junior secretary. I waited, and I then got a statement from the senior secretary, a lady called Mrs. Sims. And what she said, in effect, was that I didn't type the letter until after Robbie's death, but it was backdated to keep the records chronologically correct. Well, all of a sudden, Stuart, they're admitting that the referral letter was never sent. So I thwarted the second story, hadn't I? They couldn't really say that the letter was misplaced because it hadn't been typed.
Yeah. And I
I'm
think
sorry
you
if it
also,
sounds complicated.
yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah. But I think you also discovered, went back and re-looked at the prescription for Diorolite,
Yes,
and
but
that
what was all,
corroborated.
yes, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But what was also missing in the GP notes and the hospital notes when I received them was the Addison's letter.
Okay.
And I phoned both the Family Health Services Authority and Dr. Forbes' secretary to say that these documents were missing, that these are not the full records. But to go back to the Diorolite, when Dr. Williams gave his statement in response to my complaint, he said that Robert was not vomiting. And what he did say in his statement is roughly this: I was reassured by the fact that Robert was not vomiting, with the knowledge that vomiting is a frequent occurrence in Addison's disease. Now, that's his statement of the 20th of July, which proves also that one, that he knew of the suspicion of Addison's disease on the 11th of April. And secondly, he's denying the vomiting because it incriminates him, because what he should have done is referred Robbie immediately.
Right.
So I looked to try and disprove what he said, to prove that the vomiting did happen and that I was prescribed the Diorolite. We've thrown it out, Stuart.
Okay.
So I went down to the local chemist, who just happens to be a friend of Dr. Williams. And I asked him, Mr. Richards, do you keep copies of prescriptions? And he says, oh, come round the back, Mr. Powell, and look at my computer. And we went round the back of his shop. He put Robbie's name in, and he said, oh, I'm awfully sorry. I must have erased the prescriptions because he's deceased. I said, but Mr. Richard, you must have some type of record that you prescribed it and dispensed the Diorolite. No, I haven't got any written records at all. I said, well, where's the prescription I gave you? Oh, he says, I sent that to the Prescription Pricing Authority in Cardiff. I said, can you please phone them and ask them if they still have it? He says, no, phone them yourself. So I went home and phoned and found out that they wouldn't speak to a member of the public. They asked me who I was. I said, a bereaved father. I just want to know if you've got the prescriptions of my late son. We won't speak to you. If you want prescriptions or any type of information, you have to go to the people dealing with your complaint. So I had to go to the Family Health Services Authority and ask them to secure the 3 prescriptions that Robbie had been given, the most important one being the Diorolite. And I got it. And I could then prove that Dr. Williams had omitted that, not only from the referral letter, but also from his consultation notes.
Okay. So that was quite dogged of you to chase that down then and make sure you got that piece of evidence. And I think It's quite a
Yes, well, I knew Robert was vomiting, and I knew I was a motor mechanic, and I used to do MOTs, and we had to keep them by law for 18 months. So I
okay.
assumed that the Prescription Pricing Authority has to keep the paper record, and I got all three of them.
Okay. And then 8 months after Robbie's death, you would go to a hearing at the Medical Services Committee. So
That's
at that
correct.
stage, were you thinking of like civil damages or like a criminal investigation into the doctors, or were you just still trying to establish sort of the truth and make sure it wouldn't happen to anybody else, essentially?
All we wanted initially, Stuart, was the truth as to why Robbie died. We knew there was no intent. We knew the doctors hadn't murdered Robbie. All we wanted to know is why is this child died of a treatable disease that was suspected, that invariably results in death without treatment, and yet they don't do the test that they ordered, and they don't tell my wife and I about it. It was just unacceptable, as was the 7 consultations before he actually got to hospital. So when we went to the hearing, it was one of the worst days of my life. Take away Robbie's death and my other son's death. It was awful. There was 2 GPs on that panel. There was 2 lay people. And there was a chairman who was a magistrate. And he was rude to me from the start. He was so rude to me that one of the GPs subsequently told the police that he wanted to intervene because of the way I was being treated. But when it came to Dr. Williams, and this is an important factor, I was asked by the Family Health Services Authority, do you want to disclose the prescriptions to the doctors? And I said no. I wasn't being naive because I knew they were going to do it, but I wasn't going to give permission for that to happen because I wanted to cross-examine Dr. Williams regarding the deorolite and the vomiting. So when Dr. Williams gave his evidence, he actually admitted prescribing deorolite for the first time because he knew I had a copy of it. So I said, Dr. Williams, you claim Robert was not vomiting. Is that correct? He said, yes. Can you explain to me then why you prescribed deorolite when you say that the child wasn't vomiting, yet that's the medication that was given to him 4 months earlier, specifically for that symptom? And he nearly went under the table. I mean, he just couldn't answer. And someone shouted from the panel, you'd give that for something else, like abdominal pain, wouldn't you? And he then said abdominal pain. Now, I went to ask Dr. Williams another question, and the chairman said, would anybody else like to ask questions? And I put my hand up. I said, sir, I haven't finished. He said, you've already asked one question. I said, are you telling me, sir, that I'm not permitted to ask more than one question? He said, do not be frivolous with me, Mr. Powell, or you will be asked to leave the room. It will deal with your written evidence only. No, I became a little bit concerned and a little bit angry, right? And my good friend Sid Herbert, who was with me, actually had to grab my hand and to say, well, just keep on questioning. Don't let this guy make you lose your temper. And I didn't. But that was the whole tone of that inquiry. Also, the doctors had a professional advisor for the Medical Protection Society. And every time I was asking any questions, they were talking to their advisor before answering. Whereas I had my friend, and I was asking the questions myself that I'd prepared. But in any event, the hearing came to a conclusion. And I went home. I was there for approximately 4 hours. And the report was that they were exonerated. The 4 GPs were exonerated. But Dr. Flower, the lady on the day that Robbie died, was told that she should have conformed in future, or she should conform in future with the terms and conditions of service, and she was given the minimal reprimand.
Right.
And that was a whitewash completely of Robbie's death.
Okay then. And then I think it was taken to an appeal at the Welsh office in 1992. And I think it was at that point that you sort of discovered there was a range of extra notes and also the ACTH and Addison's suspected notes had disappeared, hadn't they?
Well, that had disappeared before the first hearing. That had disappeared when I received the records in advance of that hearing. I had the hospital records and the GP notes from the Family Services Authority in Swansea. Now, I had told them and phoned up and said that the documents are missing. I haven't got the full documents. The Addison's letter's not there. So I'd already made those allegations before the first hearing. But that hearing, the people that were involved in that thought it was acceptable and would not investigate whether that letter existed or not. The Reverend Thomas gave evidence of its existence. He was totally ignored, as I was. So we knew the Addison's letter was missing. We knew that the referral letter was a forgery, but the Medical Services Committee hearing accepted that evidence as being true, that they said it was acceptable for the doctors to say that Robert had been referred because part of the process had been done, which is clearly doesn't address the dishonest issue about them saying that he'd been referred several times when he hadn't been.
Okay.
So the Welsh office, I was then permitted to appeal to the Welsh office. That was part of the procedure at that time. And I was allowed legal representation. And I had a solicitor and a barrister, and I had a couple of medical experts. But when I went to the hearing, they'd only allocated 3 days. So over those 3 days, it was adjourned until 6 months later in September. And when we got back to the appeal, someone of the GPs that had to have been had put additional original documents in the GP file that had never been disclosed to me. And I had them checked by a forensic expert as well, and by myself. And those additional documents were added during the adjournment. And when I asked the chairman through my lawyers to investigate how this has happened, he refused to do so. And as a consequence, I withdrew from that appeal. And it cost me £34,000 in legal costs I had to pay for my lawyers. And I was told by the Welsh office that it was a gesture of goodwill that I didn't have to pay for the doctor's legal expenses. But it did cost £34,000. So I went to the Parliamentary Ombudsman to complain about the maladministration at the Welsh office. The Parliamentary Ombudsman, you have to make a complaint through your Member of Parliament. And that's what my member did, a gentleman called Jonathan Evans, MP. And what the Parliamentary Ombudsman told him was, make a complaint first, if you're going to the Welsh office. And if you're dissatisfied, I will look at it, the alleged maladministration. So we went to the Welsh office. John Redwood was the Secretary of State for Wales. My MP received a letter that claimed that the Welsh office had never received Robert's GP notes, the originals, but in fact they'd been sent by the forensic document examiner a week before the hearing started. So the only way they could have been introduced was through the Welsh office.
Okay.
So, sorry, go on.
And is it at this point, after you pay the £34,000 in legal fees and all of this, is this the point where you ask for the police investigation?
No, what happened, and that's what I was going to want to tell you, is when my MP went back to the Parliamentary Ombudsman, he then said it was outside his jurisdiction to investigate the Welsh office.
Right.
And yet, when the Parliamentary Ombudsman found out, and I made a complaint again, that the Secretary of State for Wales had given an untruthful answer in a parliamentary question, the new Parliamentary Ombudsman decided to investigate that but also investigate the 1992 Welsh Office issue. Okay. So in 1997, 5 years after the Welsh Office appeal, and after it was initially refused to be investigated, the Parliamentary Ombudsman investigated. Took 2 years, and they found the Welsh Office guilty of maladministration. So I proved my point, but the Welsh Office refused to reopen the appeal hearing or give me another hearing that would have concluded my Welsh Office appeal and my complaint against the doctors. So I decided then, after the refusal in 1993, to go to the police. And I did that in March 1994 with a substantial document, 20 pages, setting out all the evidence that we had. It was copious evidence. There was affidavits, there was statements, there was video documentaries. There was a lot of evidence. And we did that in March. And that started the first police investigation.
Okay. And what do you think would go wrong with the two Dyfed Powys police investigations? And how significant do you think Dr. Evans' 1996 letter to the police was?
Well, a lot of people may not agree with me, but I believe that Dyfed Powys police, who actually retained these GPs as police surgeons, they were associated with the doctors. And I believe that Dyfed Powys police decided to ignore the evidence to protect these doctors. That's my belief. Right. And what happened then is they didn't actually get expert reports. Instead of looking at the case properly and getting expert opinion, they decided not to do that, but to tell me in January of 1996 the case has been closed. So I made a bit of a fuss, obviously, and complained about it. And what happened then was that they actually appointed an endocrinologist to look at the hospital. And the endocrinologist found that every doctor in that hospital, of the paediatric department, where Dr. Dewi Evans headed, as I understood it, were all negligent, and that Dr. Forbes was grossly negligent. Mm. Now, what the expert said was that when Addison's was suspected, it should have been diagnosed and Robert wouldn't have died. Now, because they'd actually decided to go and get expert opinion, there was an article in the Mail and Sunday saying that there's an investigation into gross negligent manslaughter. Also, around late 1995, Dewi Evans was asked by the hospital administration to trace a doctor or the doctor that had discharged Robbie in the December. So Dr. Dewi Evans was given Robert's full hospital records. So he contacted the doctor who the police had been looking to find. So Dr. Evans wrote to the Dyfed Powys police during the time that they were going to consider gross negligence against the GPs. They'd already done that with the hospital. It was now the GPs. He then provided Dr. Keith Hughes with a 3-page letter, which was a report exonerating them of any fault. Now, you have to now consider, what did Dr. Evans know when he wrote that report? We know he had the hospital records, so he knew that Addison's was suspected. He knew that they'd been told that Addison's is suspected. They knew that they'd been told that Robert needed an ACTH test that hadn't been done. And we know that the test, had he done it, Robert would have lived. Now, what Dr. Evans also admitted, that he had read a detailed newspaper article in The Guardian on Christmas Eve 1994. Now, that article was 8 A4 pages, and it set out the failures of the GPs and the falsification of Robbie's records. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Dewi Evans had that information, and yet he wrote to these doctors supporting them when in fact he knew them personally. And he's admitted since that he used to visit that health centre twice a month.
Right. Okay.
So he knew them personally. And when in Northern Ireland, when Dr. Dewi Evans was part of the hyponatremia inquiry, he was critical of a doctor who was associated with the hospital who provided a report because they should have someone independent. And he knew that. And as a consequence of what he did, I believe the police did not get another expert to look at the GPs.
Right. Okay. And I'm not sure, Dr. Watts, do you have any comment at this point about the conduct of the police investigation at all?
Yes, I do. So just a little bit about my background. I served in British policing for 32 years, most of that time as an investigator. And latterly in my career, I was probably one of the most senior investigators in British policing. I was the vice chair of the homicide working group of the Association of Chief Police Officers, which set standards and practice in relation to the investigation of homicide. That includes murder and manslaughter. And I also took forward the work and was the author of the ACPO guidance, the Association of Chief Police Officers national guidance in relation to the death of people in healthcare settings. That guidance came into place sometime after Robbie's death, but it certainly was based upon best practice that would have been in place at the time. Mr. Powell and his family have been treated disgracefully by the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Welsh Office, the Parliamentary Ombudsman, and the GMC. All elements of the state that should be there to provide support, to act with integrity, and to investigate the circumstances surrounding Robbie's tragic death. And it's lamentable that none of them did anything in that regard, and that we're in the position we are today, with Mr. Powell and his wife still working to get justice for their son. So the investigation that was carried out by Difford Parish Police was clearly incompetent, and that's been recorded officially by the Crown Prosecution Service and other elements. However, an investigation was carried out subsequently by DCI Bob Poole, who tragically has now passed on. And I've read that document in detail. That is a commendable document. He carried out a thorough, robust, and balanced investigation and made a number of recommendations in relation to potential charges that should have been put before the courts at that time. The Crown Prosecution Service decided not to go ahead with those charges on the basis of abuse of process, in as much that time had passed, or too much time had passed. The reason for that passage of time was the failure of the police and failures in the Crown Prosecution Service, which they have admitted to. And in addition, they talk about the fact that a senior police officer from Difford Parish Police wrote a letter to the doctors telling them that there would be no further action in relation to the investigation, which is, I believe, specious in as much as that letter does not provide immunity, or did not provide immunity to the persons at that time, to the GPs at that time. So I think this is an egregious miscarriage in relation to Mr. Powell and his family, and they have been denied justice for the terrible death of their son in the circumstances that it occurred. So I'm trying to do all that I can to support Mr. Powell in taking this forward, and to ensure that as far as we can at this late stage, justice is achieved so far as it's possible to do so.
Okay, thank you for that. And then, Will, so looking at December 1999, I think you made a complaint against the Chief Constable of David Powers Police. How did that lead to West Midlands Police taking over the case?
I'd actually made a complaint against the Deputy Chief Constable in 1998, and that's what resulted in the second criminal investigation by David Powers Police, which was found to be institutionally incompetent as well. And that was by Avon and Somerset Police and also the Police Complaints Authority.
Right.
But when I complained and they reopened the investigation, the second one, I realised that I was only being paid lip service. The investigation wasn't being done as it should have been, and they weren't properly following lines of inquiry that I had articulated. So I then decided to make a complaint against the Chief Constable. It was as a consequence of that complaint that Bob Poole from West Midlands Police was appointed to review Robbie's case. And that was around April, May of 2000. And as a consequence of Bob Poole's inquiry and investigation, he took 140 plus Section 9 statements, where David Powers Police had taken a couple. He hadn't even taken statements from myself and my wife, who were the main complainants here with the evidence against the doctors. So that's why Bob Poole was appointed. He was appalled by the behaviour of both the police and the CPS. The CPS had given advices to David Powers Police in the absence of Section 9 statements, when you cannot prosecute, and I'm sure Steve will agree with me, without those statements, because you don't understand the weight of evidence.
Right. Yeah, okay. I mean that's absolutely right. The initial investigation by David Powers Police was just disgraceful. You know, they had not followed basic lines of inquiry. They'd not gathered the evidence that they were required to do, and it was only when DCI Poole came along that thorough investigation was conducted. And unfortunately, I think that was too late.
Right. Okay. So a further question for Mr. Powell then. So I think one of the findings, from Bob Poole's investigation was that a further doctor had forged medical records, Dr. Nicola Flower. So how did he figure that out then?
Well, he didn't figure it out because it was figured out in 1992 because I had commissioned a forensic document examiner to look at the GP notes. And when a GP actually visits a home of a patient, they write out what they call sticky notes. And they write the notes in at the time, contemporaneously, but they then give them to staff to stick them into the original notes. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's quite a simple process. Mm-hmm. Well, the forensic report that I had commissioned actually confirmed that Dr. Flowers, his contemporaneous notes, allegedly, was written while on top of the original notes, right, which makes it no point in writing on the slips. Mm-hmm. Now, you have to remember that Dr. Flower said that Robert wasn't seriously ill, and that's why she never sent him to hospital earlier that day. She even said he wasn't that unwell when she agreed to send him, and yet he died almost on arrival. So that was proven in 1992. It was apparently ignored by everybody I brought into their attention. But what Bob did is he was able, because ESTA tests are tests that do indentations in paper. If there's somebody written something like underneath another page, there's indentations left. And what Bob was able to do was he had them sequenced, and they found out that she didn't write those notes until 6 and 8 weeks after Robbie died. So they were not contemporaneous, and they were clearly untrue. So that was an important factor in him confirming then that there were forgeries.
Oh, okay. So another question for Steve then. So, if you're investigating a manslaughter case, especially in this kind of sort of environment, how do you determine whether it's a single person who sort of bears responsibility, or if it's going to be a case of joint enterprise, gross negligence, manslaughter?
Well, you follow the evidence. It's as
Right.
simple as that. You gather all the relevant evidence you possibly can, and then you analyze evidence and identify where it points in terms of potential offenders and potential charges. So it's not until you've got all that evidence together that you're going to know exactly what the relevant charges are going to be that are going to be suggested to the Crown Prosecution Service. So it's criminal investigation isn't difficult. It's a process, and that process needs to be taken forward diligently and robustly and with integrity. And if that's done in all cases, in the case of Robbie, in the case of Lucy Letby, then at the end of the day, the Crown Prosecution Service can make a rational decision based upon all the available relevant evidence. And that's not what happened here until DCI Paul came along and provided that evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Okay. So would responsibility be partly determined in terms of sort of seniority, or would there need to be evidence of collusion to it, or would it just be a case of who was responsible for the key procedures or sort of interventions?
Well, in relation to manslaughter, you need to demonstrate whether a person who is suspected had a duty of care. So whether GPs had a duty of care, whether specialists had a duty of care, whether people at the hospital had a duty of care, that needs to be established first. And then it's about the extent to which they could be expected to deliver that care and the way in which they did it. And whether or not the care that they provided was appropriate given the level of care that would be provided by a reasonable professional in those circumstances, given the condition of the individual.
Right. Okay. And then another question for Will. So at the conclusion of DCI Paul's investigation, he recommended 35 charges. Can you remember what those charges were? All of them?
I do. Some were alternative charges, but the main charges were 1, gross negligent manslaughter, 2, forgery, 3, perverting the course of justice, and 4, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Now, I'd like to say also, Stuart, that Bob Poole presented to the CPS in York medical evidence that Dr. Forbes was grossly negligent and that 4 of the 5 GPs were grossly negligent and a substantial cause of Robbie's death. Those are facts that was presented to the CPS. They chose to ignore the gross negligence against all the doctors except for Dr. Flower. And as far as I was concerned, had she referred Robbie to hospital sooner, the child would have lived. And had he been sent the day before, there could be no argument that he would have lived. But yet the CPS decided not to prosecute Dr. Flower for gross negligent manslaughter or consider the other GPs.
And knowing what you know now, do you think perhaps you could add another charge of potentially obstruction in terms of Dr. Evans, in terms of knowing what he said about that 1996 letter to the police, considering everything he knew? Do you think?
Well, I think, to be honest, that if there was a proper police investigation, or the police, we know, the reason I had Dr. Dewi Evans' letter, because it was in the police files.
Okay.
And I didn't get them from the police, I got them from the General Medical Council, because I'd requested all the documents that they're going to disclose to the doctors to be disclosed to me. And they tried not to do that, but I had tied them up in a way that they had to do it. And in the box of files I had, which is substantial, it was 3, do the ream boxes that hold 5 reams of paper. There was 3 of them full of documents. And in it was Dr. Evans's report to the GPs. So it was clearly relied upon by Dyfed-Powys Police. And that's why I believe they didn't get another expert to look at the gross negligence of the GPs at that time. We're talking between 1994 and 1996. So I think, yes, I think Dr. Evans conspired with the doctors to ensure that they weren't prosecuted.
Okay.
And I think if there was a proper investigation now, it should include his involvement in this. And I think, from what I understand from Steve, is that he believes that the police and the CPS should have set up a panel of experts when they looked at Robbie's case because of the obvious gross negligence of these doctors. And that had they done that, then there's a possibility they would have been charged then. But if it happened now, I understand, and I'm sure Steve will respond to this, that if they were to do it now, there's a possibility that they could still be prosecuted for either gross negligent manslaughter, corporate manslaughter, or joint enterprise.
Any comment on that, Dr. Watts, about still current prosecution?
Yeah, I agree with what Will says, that had this been investigated properly, had they used a panel of experts, independent experts, to provide evidence in relation to, had they provided a panel of relevant independent experts to review across the disciplines exactly what the situation was in relation to Robbie's death, then that evidence could have been put before the Crown Prosecution Service, and it's far more likely the Crown Prosecution Service would have considered more rigorously whether charges should be laid.
Okay. And then in
Can I
terms
say
of
this,
this,
though, Stuart, which is important? Although the Crown Prosecution Service in York agreed that there was sufficient evidence to prosecute for forgery and pervert the course of justice against two of the GPs, Williams and Flower, and the secretary who typed the referral letter, one of the reasons they told me was that if they had prosecuted for gross negligent manslaughter, that those charges would have been included. Now, when you look at the sentence for perversion of the course of justice, in serious cases, it could be life. So it was a very serious offence. And the reasons the CPS are claiming that they couldn't prosecute Dr. Flower in particular, because they can't prove that Robert couldn't have survived after she failed to get him to hospital, when in fact he died on arrival. So I don't know how on earth they could come to that conclusion. I mean, she refused an ambulance. She didn't send him in on the first occasion, sent him in on the second. But at the time I drove to the hospital, the child died in front of me. So how they say that they can't prosecute Dr. Flower is beyond me.
Yeah. I guess a question for Dr. Watts maybe is, do you think is there maybe more apprehension when they consider prosecuting like maybe 5 or 6 people, as opposed to if they can single out one individual? Or from your experience working with the Crown Prosecution Service, is that not a factor? You think?
It shouldn't be a factor. I'm not sure whether it was on this occasion, but to each individual, whether that it discloses individual culpability or joint enterprise culpability is the matter for consideration, and whether it reaches the 2 tests. Firstly, is the evidential threshold. Is there sufficient evidence to give a reasonable chance of a prosecution? It's clear in this case, because the CPS had said so, that there was that evidential sufficiency. And the second test is whether it's in the public interest. Well, I'm not sure that I can think of any other sort of case than the death of a young boy as being more in the public interest in terms of prosecuting it and putting the matter before the court, for the court to decide the issues, and the court to decide on the guilt or otherwise of the individuals concerned.
Okay. So
can I say this, Stuart?
Yeah.
Because I think this is really important. The medical expert, Professor Ian Hughes, who gave evidence in relation to Robbie's case and the gross negligence of 4 of the GPs, and it was his evidence that resulted in them not being prosecuted. In 2012, a young boy died of Addison's disease. Now, he hadn't been suspected of Addison's. He'd been ill on the first day. The mother had apparently phoned the health centre. It's not a different health centre, it's 40 miles from where we live. The GP didn't come out, but told the mother she could bring the child to the health centre, and the mother, for whatever reason, didn't take the child. The mother phoned another GP out later on that day, which it was a Friday, and the GP said she wouldn't come out at that time, but to bring the child to the health centre on the Monday. The child went to bed at 11 o'clock at night, and he died in the early hours of the morning from Addison's disease. And yet those 2 doctors were prosecuted for gross negligent manslaughter in Wales.
Okay.
The thing was, they were acquitted. Sorry?
I think that's clearly a particular frustration for Will and his family, the fact that there's a lack of consistency around this decision making. You've got cases very similar to Robbie's, where after a number of years people have been prosecuted. A very recent case in relation to a woman being administered paracetamol inappropriately is being taken forward. There needs to be not only justice, but justice delivered in a consistent way by the police, by the Crown Prosecution Service, and by the courts.
Okay. And then another question for Steve in terms of this letter, the supposed immunity letter. Have you sent letters like that before in your career, and were there particular issues with this letter?
Right. Well, to start with, it's not an immunity letter.
Okay. Yeah.
I've regularly sent, as have other detectives, day in, day out. You send letters to people who have been interviewed, perhaps arrested in relation to offences, and interviewed, and you get to a point with some of them where you're not going to get any further with the investigation. So regularly, you will send them a letter just indicating that the investigation is finished, that there'll be no further action. Generally, in those letters, I would add a paragraph that would say, unless any further information relevant information comes to light. So all you're doing is you're informing somebody that the investigation has ceased at that stage. You're not giving them immunity from prosecution to any extent whatsoever. In fact, the police don't have the power to do that. Immunity can only be given, as I understand it, on the approval of the Attorney General.
Okay.
You know, we know, don't we, that a lot of terrorists in Northern Ireland have not been prosecuted because of letters sent to them giving them immunity. That's a really serious step to say to somebody, you're never going to be investigated again or prosecuted for this offence, no matter what evidence or information turns up. So for the Crown Prosecution Service to rely on a letter sent by a senior police officer in those circumstances, I think it's specious. I think it's an excuse not to prosecute. You know, I don't think the letter had any weight whatsoever, apart from just informing the individuals that the investigation was closed at that stage.
Okay.
Can I come in here a minute, please, Stuart?
Sorry?
I think, can I just say this?
Yeah, sure.
The CPS, I agree 100% with what Steve has said. It wasn't an immunity letter. The police didn't have the authority to give an immunity letter. And normally, immunity is given when someone has witnessed a serious crime like murder and they've committed a minor crime. The Crown or the Director of Public Prosecutions or the Attorney General can grant them immunity because they could then give evidence in relation to a murder. So it's a deal that they do with some people. In Robbie's case, the CPS are accepting that it's an immunity letter, and yet there was no deal with the GPs to do anything for the Crown, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Okay. And can you describe your experience reporting these doctors to the General Medical Council?
The General Medical Council, firstly, has the power to investigate doctors irrespective of the source. If there's allegations of neglect, allegations of cover-up in the media, the GMC can actually investigate the doctors without a complaint. They denied that during a judicial review, but I had a freedom of information request that confirmed that between 1993 and 2009, which was the time of the judicial review, the GMC had opened 575 inquiries into doctors on newspaper articles alone. Now, we have to now look at what media coverage has Robbie's case had. And it was immense at the beginning. We had the Mail on Sunday, we had documentaries in Wales This Week documentaries, allegations of negligence, allegations of forgery, perverting justice. And yet the GMC, according to them, at the judicial review, said that they couldn't investigate Robbie's death because that media coverage was too sparse. Mm-hmm. So the point I'm making is the GMC has always been able to investigate Robbie's case, but choose not to. Now, the GPs in 1992 libelled my wife and I. They called my wife and I liars, distorters of the facts, and fantasists. And I sued them for libel. Now, during the libel proceedings, I asked the GMC, or the GMC tried to encourage me to make a complaint in 1997. And I said, I can't because I want to go to court. I haven't got any evidence. And remember now, the police had covered it up in my view. I knew the GMC doesn't take action against most UK doctors. And I thought, I'm going to go to the libel case and hopefully have the evidence that I can prove that these doctors have lied and covered up. And the GMC accepted that, even though they could have pursued the doctors on their own. Well, the libel case wasn't settled after Bob Poole set out the 35 charges. But during Bob Poole's criminal investigation, he put the GMC on notice of the GP's negligence and the dishonesty in relation to the fabrication of Robert's medical records. And in 2001, the GMC told me in writing that they are now going to await DCI Poole's conclusion to his investigation before they consider what action to take against the doctors. But the GMC then, in November of 2002, just 4 months before the conclusion of Robert's criminal investigation and the decision by the CPS, they covertly introduced a 5-year time limit. Now, they told me over the years consistently that there was no time limit. And here they are secretly introducing such a time limit. And what happened then was the GMC met with the Crown Prosecution Service and members of Dudley Powers Police, but they excluded Bob Poole. And the point of that meeting was, because the CPS will not be prosecuting, that they were going to make a referral to the GMC. Now, the meeting took place. I have the minutes of that meeting. The GMC informed the police and the CPS that all that was needed was a simple letter of referral. The 2 CPS Crown prosecutors from York, who'd made the decision not to prosecute, then did not make a referral to the GMC. So the referral that Bob wanted to be made was never made. And they told me it had been made. But the police and the CPS also told me that I should make a complaint to the GMC. So in June of 2003, I made that complaint. The police and the CPS knew about the 5-year time limit and didn't tell me. The GMC then sat on my complaint for 5 years and then engaged the 5-year time limit and struck her out.
Okay.
So the GMC refused to investigate Robbie's case, yet in Northern Ireland, they investigated doctors who committed offences 25 years previously.
Then
so the GMC, in my view, is corrupt and has been in relation to Robbie's case.
Anything to add on that, Steve?
No, I think that the whole affair is absolutely disgraceful. You know, they had every opportunity to advise Will that he needed to make a complaint within the 5-year limit, and they didn't do so. I think it's a disgrace.
Right. Okay.
Can I just say one other thing, Steve? Stuart, sorry. What I don't understand. Now, the two CPS prosecutors from York and Special Division decide that they can't prosecute these doctors because of the passage of time and this so-called immunity letter, which we now know wasn't valid. Okay? Now, in my view, if I was a CPS prosecutor who knew all the facts about the Robbie Powell case, and that I couldn't prosecute them because of a technicality, because that's really what it was, right? The evidence was there. They say they couldn't do it. What I can't understand for the life of me is why those two prosecutors would go to the regulator knowing what these doctors had done, knowing what they'd got away with. They were told to make the referral, promised me that they had made it, and yet they didn't. And as a consequence, the case was struck out by the GMC. And the point is this, though, Stuart. When Bob Poole put the GMC on notice of a formal referral, there was no time limit. He'd actually told the GMC that before they covertly introduced the time limit. So it was a complete stitch-up in relation to the GMC and the investigation of Robbie's case, which was assisted by the Crown Prosecution Service and members of David Power's police.
Okay. And then a question for Dr. Watts. Do you think there are any steps being taken, perhaps behind the scenes, maybe for if there, well, on exoneration for a public inquiry around the Lucy Letby case, and potentially is there a viable route to sort of include both the Robbie Powell cases and Lucy Letby cases together in a public inquiry at all?
As far as the first part of your question is concerned, I don't see any evidence that there's any work being done preparatory to that.
Okay,
I think
sure.
that people are hoping, those that believe Lucy Letby to be guilty are hoping that the CCRC will not refer this matter to the Court of Appeal. And on that basis, I don't think there's any arrangement being made.
Okay.
I think there's a need for a public inquiry in relation to specifically the Lucy Letby case and specifically Robbie Powell's case, because I think there are issues and there are still issues in relation to Robbie's case that need to be resolved. But I think there is also the potential for an inquiry into the raft of healthcare-related prosecutions, failed prosecutions that have been made over the years. And we can all think of the names of the people concerned to establish, how do the police, how do the Crown Prosecution Service, how do the judiciary deal with these very, very difficult, very complex cases. So I think there's work to be done there as well.
Okay. And then, Will, can you describe trying to take the case to the European Court of Human Rights?
Right. This was a civil case for negligence against the GPs for Robbie's death and the hospital. There was 2 defendants. We were also claiming for psychological injury that was caused to my wife and I by the dishonesty of the doctors after Robbie died. And that claim was estimated at £300,000. For Robbie's death was £5,000. That was the statutory payment. The remainder was for the psychological injury caused to me because I was the main breadwinner and I had lost earnings, which resulted in 25 years of lost earnings. And my wife, who was the mother of the children, she was claiming for psychological injury, which was exacerbated by the cover-up. Well, they asked, both defendants asked to settle Robbie's case out of court. Now, there's no amount of money was mentioned, but the claim was estimated at 300 grand. Mm-hmm. We refused to accept any settlement out of court. It was never about money. It's been always about getting at the truth. It was a time when I was on benefits. We mortgaged our house to pay those costs. We're living week by week. And we decided it isn't the 300 grand. We don't want that. We want to go to court, at the civil court, and prove what these doctors had done. Because we refused, the health authority then admitted liability for Robbie's death and paid £80,000 into court for Robbie's death and my wife's psychological damage. The doctors denied my damage because it happened after Robbie died. The psychiatrist that assessed me claimed, and I don't know why she did, that I wasn't damaged by Robbie's death. Okay. I was actually suicidal on the night. I had to drive home on my own, and thinking about it upsets me, because to say that I didn't have an adverse reaction to Robbie's death is a lie. But nevertheless, the psychiatrist ruled that I hadn't been damaged by Robbie's death. I'd been damaged post-death. So the GPs, after the admission of liability was made by the hospital in relation to Robbie's death, they made an application to the court to strike out my case. And it was heard in Cardiff, and it was heard in chambers. The judge wouldn't hear it publicly. And the doctors argued, we do not have a legal duty of candor post-death to tell Will Powell the truth about the negligent death of Robbie, right? And any damage we have caused is not actionable. Well, the High Court agreed with that. They said I'm not entitled to compensation in civil law. Now, what the court could have done is, because the doctors had presented false evidence to the court, that was a tort, that was an action that could have been taken against them for conspiracy. And the courts never dealt with that issue at all. They just struck my case out, meaning I wasn't entitled to compensation. Mm-hmm. Now, my wife and I decided that we would appeal that decision to the Court of Appeal. And we did that, and we lost. So they took the £80,000 compensation off my wife because we were unsuccessful in our claim. We asked the Court of Appeal to forward the case to the House of Lords, and they refused. We petitioned the House of Lords, and they then refused to hear the case and agreed with the Court of Appeal. It's now been proven that the Court of Appeal and the High Court was wrong, because they should have looked at the conspiracy, because the doctors had denied me compensation through unlawful means. But nevertheless, the House of Lords agreed with it. That then gave me the right to go to Europe. And we went to Europe. And in 2000, the European Court ruled that, as the law stands now, however, doctors did not have to tell parents the truth about the negligent circumstances of their child's death, nor refrain from falsifying records. So our case wasn't heard in Europe. But I've now proven over the years that the European Court not only got the facts of Robbie's case wrong, they got their own case law wrong. And I now have a 20-page document that's been drafted that I commissioned with legal lens that highlights the failures of the UK courts and the European Court to adequately deal with Robbie's case. So we ended up with no compensation at all for that damage it was caused to us.
Yeah, I think anybody who watches this will see why it's so contentious that after having provided such negligent care that they do all that in the civil court, those doctors, spend. Right, yeah.
Like the justice system, the civil system has failed us. We've tried. We're not vindictive people. My wife and I were good parents, all right. We're not vindictive. We knew that the doctors didn't intentionally kill our son. Mm-hmm. But what they did was they caused his death because they didn't care. They were grossly negligent. And to cover up their gross negligence, to stop a prosecution of gross negligent manslaughter, they falsified the records. And once doctors falsify records, it is difficult to prove it. In relation to the Addison's letter, I haven't proven that existed. I have reports of a judge it was a Queen's Counsel and a junior barrister. The Queen's Counsel is now a judge. And they believe, based on the evidence I presented, that the Addison's letter existed. But I've never had that properly investigated. For 36 years, they haven't investigated the missing Addison's letter. Because if they did, and if they proved that it existed, there's then more evidence to make these doctors culpable for failing to get Robert treated for Addison's.
Anything you'd like to say as a closing statement, Steve?
Yeah, just to reiterate, I've looked at these documents. I understand investigations, and in particular, I understand the investigation of deaths in healthcare settings. So with that background, I've examined the documents that Will has given me, including the report of Bob Poole, a very comprehensive, over 500-page report where he identifies 35 potential charges, including alternates. And I'm absolutely convinced that that's what should have happened, that those charges should have been put all those years ago and justice done by an appropriate hearing before a court. Will has worked really hard with his wife to keep this matter at the forefront in terms of trying to make change, beneficial change, not just for themselves, not just to get the truth, but to make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen to other families, and that's commendable. One of the things that he can be very proud of achieving is the legislation currently going through the courts in relation to the duty of candour for public professionals in relation to investigations and the matters similar to this. It also involves the Hillsborough families, of course. But I'm quite concerned, having read that potential legislation, it actually doesn't go far enough. I think there's a big issue because the duty of candour, as I read the bill, only relates to professionals, including doctors, being candid with investigations. It doesn't talk about being candid with families. So I think that legislation needs to be extended to include not just a duty of candour by professionals to any sort of investigation, but also a duty of candour to families, particularly in the circumstances that Will and his family found themselves.
Okay. And Will, anything you'd like to say as a closing statement?
Well, I'd just like to say on top of what Steve has said, firstly, thank you, Steve. What we did in relation to exposing the absence of a duty of candour was a seed for the duty of candour today. Had we not exposed it 30 years ago, I don't think Hillsborough would be asking for a duty of candour for public officers and officials, because even after the court proved and ruled that there was no legal duty of candour, the Labour government denied this in correspondence to me, saying that the judgment in Robbie's case in Europe didn't mean that doctors didn't have to tell the truth. But exactly that's what it did mean. And because of the publicity that we have had over the years, a legal duty of candour was introduced for organisations after the mid-staff's investigation, which I accept. But Sir Robert Francis would have made that recommendation had I not and my wife exposed its absence. So it's pretty disappointing that the government hasn't recognised the part that I've played and my wife in actually exposing this law, which needs to be introduced as soon as possible. We need an individual legal duty of candour for all public officials, and it should be called Robbie's Law, after Robbie, I think, for what we sacrificed to have it implemented.